The smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled Murphy's Diner on that quiet Tuesday morning in Riverside, a small town in Southern Virginia. The old establishment had been serving the community for 40 years, its red vinyl booths and checkered floor worn smooth by generations of families. Sarah Mitchell sat in her usual corner booth, her military uniform crisp despite the early hour. At 32, she had served her country for 10 years, including 2 tours overseas. The Purple Heart pinned inside her jacket pocket told only part of her story. The injuries she'd sustained, saving 3 fellow soldiers from an explosion, had left her with a permanent limp and nerve damage in her left hand that caused it to tremble slightly. She didn't wear her medals to breakfast. She never did. Sarah preferred to blend in, to be just another customer enjoying Emma's famous pancakes. Across the diner, 15-year-old Katie Reynolds sat with her mother, Margaret. Katie had cerebral palsy, which affected her motor skills and speech. She moved slowly, and her words sometimes came out slurred, but her bright blue eyes sparkled with intelligence and kindness. Sarah had noticed the girl before, always patient, always smiling despite the challenges her condition presented. This morning, Katie was excited. Sarah could see it in the way she carefully held up a certificate to show her mother. Even from across the room, Sarah could make out the words, "Honor Roll." The girl had every right to be proud. The bell above the diner's door chimed and 3 teenage boys walked in. Sarah recognized them immediately. Brad Hutchinson and his 2 friends, Tyler and Derek, were known troublemakers in Riverside. Their parents had money which seemed to shield them from consequences. Sarah had seen them around town before, always loud, always looking for someone to pick on. They spotted Katie almost immediately. "Hey, look who it is," Brad said loudly, his voice carrying across the quiet diner. "It's Katie the robot girl." The diner fell silent. Margaret wrapped her arm protectively around her daughter, but Katie kept her head down, trying to ignore them. The boys moved closer to their booth, emboldened by the audience. Tyler started mimicking Katie's movements, jerking his arms in an exaggerated way. Derek laughed cruelly. "Does she even understand what's happening?" he asked Brad, as if Katie wasn't right there. Sarah's jaw tightened. She set down her coffee cup carefully, her training helping her maintain control even as anger built inside her chest. "Please leave us alone," Margaret said quietly, her voice shaking. "We're just trying to have breakfast." "We're just having fun," Brad sneered. He reached out and knocked the certificate from Katie's hands. It fluttered to the floor. What happened next made Sarah's blood run cold. As Katie leaned down to reach for her certificate, Brad slapped her across the face. The sound cracked through the diner like a gunshot. Katie's head snapped to the side, and she let out a small cry of pain and shock. "Oops," Brad said, grinning. "My hand slipped, just like hers always does." Margaret screamed. Katie started to cry, silent tears streaming down her reddening cheek. Other customers gasped, but no one moved. The boys were laughing now, feeding off each other's cruelty. Emma, the elderly owner, reached for the phone behind the counter to call the police, but Sarah was already standing. She didn't run. Despite her injury, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse than 3 spoiled teenagers. She crossed the diner in steady steps, her limp barely noticeable now that purpose drove her forward. "That's enough," Sarah said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Brad turned to her, still smiling. He looked her up and down, taking in her uniform, and his grin widened. "What are you going to do about it, Army girl? You gonna arrest us?" Sarah stood between the boys and Katie's booth. She was only 5'6", but something in her presence made the teenagers take a step back. "I'm going to give you one chance to apologize," Sarah said calmly. "One chance to do the right thing." Tyler laughed nervously. "Or what?" Sarah's expression didn't change. "Or you'll learn that actions have consequences, something you clearly should have learned a long time ago." Brad crossed his arms, trying to look tough. My dad owns half this town. You can't touch me. We'll see, Sarah said quietly. What none of them knew was that Sarah Mitchell had spent the last 10 years not just serving her country, but serving justice. And she was about to teach these boys a lesson they would never forget. Part 2. Standing Her Ground. The standoff in Murphy's diner lasted only seconds, but to Sarah, time seemed to slow down the way it always did when danger approached. She recognized the feeling from combat, the heightened awareness, the crystal-clear focus, the absolute certainty of purpose. Brad Hutchinson stared at her with the arrogant smirk of someone who had never truly faced consequences. At 17, he stood a full head taller than Sarah, his athletic build a testament to his position as the high school's star quarterback. Behind him, Tyler and Derek shifted their weight nervously, suddenly less confident now that an adult had intervened. Last chance, Sarah said, her voice steady. Apologize to Katie and her mother, and we can end this peacefully. Brad's face twisted with contempt. You think you're tough because you're wearing that uniform? My uncle's a colonel, real military, not some secretary playing soldier. The insult hung in the air. Sarah had heard variations of it before, the assumption that women in the military weren't real soldiers, that they hadn't seen real combat, that their service was somehow less meaningful. She had learned long ago not to let such words touch her. I'm not here because of my uniform, Sarah said. I'm here because you just assaulted a disabled child in front of witnesses. That's a crime, regardless of who your father or uncle might be. Margaret had pulled Katie close, shielding her daughter with her body. Katie's cheek was still red from the slap, her tears still flowing. Sarah could see the fear in the young girl's eyes, and it reminded her of another young person she had once tried to protect in a village far from here. She had failed that time, arriving too late to prevent tragedy. She wouldn't fail now. Emma had already called the police, but Sarah knew it would take time for them to arrive. Riverside only had 4 officers on duty at any given time, and the station was on the other side of town. You're the one who's going to be in trouble, Tyler spoke up, trying to sound threatening. You're assaulting us right now. You're standing in our way, threatening us. Sarah almost smiled at the attempt to twist the situation. I haven't touched any of you. I'm simply standing here in a public place, exercising my right to occupy this space, but please, do tell the police that you feel threatened by a woman with a limp who's doing nothing but standing still. Derek tugged on Brad's sleeve. Come on, man. Let's just go. This is stupid. But Brad's pride wouldn't let him back down, especially not in front of the dozen customers now watching from their booths. His father, Richard Hutchinson, owned the town's largest construction company and sat on the town council. Brad had grown up believing he was untouchable, that rules applied to other people, but never to him. Move, Brad said, stepping toward Sarah, or I'll move you myself. Sarah didn't budge. You put your hands on me, son, and you'll be adding assault of a military service member to your charges. That's a federal offense. Your father's money won't help you then. The bell above the door chimed again. Sarah didn't take her eyes off Brad, but she heard the heavy footsteps and recognized them immediately. Jack Morrison, her former commanding officer and current owner of the local hardware store, had come in for his morning coffee. Sarah! Jack's deep voice carried concern. He took in the scene quickly, the crying girl, the protective mother, the 3 teenage boys, and Sarah standing like a barrier between them. Just handling a situation, sir, Sarah said, using his old rank more out of habit than necessity. Jack moved to stand beside her. At 6'3" and built like a bear, his presence changed the dynamic immediately. Seems like you boys were just leaving, he said. It wasn't a question. Brad's confidence finally cracked. Facing one woman was one thing, but Jack Morrison was another matter entirely. Everyone in Riverside knew Jack had served in special forces for 20 years. The man was a legend. This isn't over, Brad muttered, but he was already backing toward the door. Actually, it is, came another voice. Officer Tom Brennan had just walked in, his hand resting casually on his belt near his radio. Tom was young, only 26, and this was his first real job as a police officer. Sarah knew him from church, a good kid trying to do right in a town that didn't always make it easy. "I got a call about an assault," Tom said, his eyes scanning the diner. They landed on Katie's red cheek, then moved to the three boys. "Anyone want to tell me what happened here?" For the first time, Brad looked genuinely worried. The difference between getting away with cruelty and facing actual law enforcement had just become very real. Emma stepped forward from behind the counter, her lined face set in determination. "I saw everything, officer. That boy there," she pointed at Brad, "slapped this young girl across the face, unprovoked. I have it on my security camera, too." Sarah watched Brad's face go pale. He hadn't thought about cameras. Tom nodded slowly. "Is that true, son?" "She's lying," Brad started to say, but his voice lacked conviction. "The camera doesn't lie," Emma said firmly. "And I've got a diner full of witnesses who saw you boys harassing this child." Margaret finally spoke, her voice stronger now. "He hit my daughter. I want to press charges." Tom looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. She would testify to everything she had witnessed. "All right," Tom said, reaching for his handcuffs. "Brad Hutchinson, you're under arrest for assault." The diner erupted in whispers as Tom read Brad his rights. Tyler and Derek were told to stay put for questioning. As Brad was led out in handcuffs, he shot Sarah a look of pure hatred. Sarah didn't flinch. She had faced down armed enemies overseas. A spoiled teenager didn't frighten her, but she knew this was only the beginning. The Hutchinson family wouldn't take this lying down. The real battle was just starting. Part 3, The Storm, arrives. By that evening, the entire town of Riverside knew what had happened at Murphy's Diner. In a community of just 8,000 people, news traveled faster than wildfire, especially news that involved the Hutchinson family. Sarah sat on her front porch, watching the sunset over the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance. Her small house on Maple Street had been her refuge since returning from her last deployment 3 years ago. The quiet evenings, the friendly neighbors, the peaceful routine, it had all helped her heal from wounds both visible and invisible. Her phone had been ringing all day. Reporters from the local newspaper wanted her story. Friends from church called to offer support. But there had been other calls too, from numbers she didn't recognize, voices she didn't know, asking her why she had decided to ruin a young man's future over a simple misunderstanding. She hadn't answered those calls. Jack Morrison's truck pulled up to her curb just as the streetlights flickered on. He climbed out carrying 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag from Murphy's Diner. "Figured you might not have eaten," he said, handing her one of the cups. Sarah smiled gratefully. "You figured right." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the neighborhood settle in for the night. Mrs. Chen across the street was watering her garden. The Martinez kids were playing basketball in their driveway. The sound of the bouncing ball, a familiar rhythm. "Richard Hutchinson called me this afternoon," Jack said finally. "Offered me $10,000 to convince you to drop the charges." Sarah's jaw tightened. "What did you say?" "I told him where he could shove his money." Jack took a sip of his coffee. "Then he threatened me. Said he'd make sure the bank didn't approve my loan for expanding the hardware store." "Jack, I'm sorry. I never meant to drag you into this." "You didn't drag me anywhere. I walked into that diner of my own free will, and I'd do it again." He looked at her seriously. "But you need to know what you're up against. The Hutchinson family has been running this town for 3 generations. Richard doesn't lose, and he doesn't forgive." Sarah had already figured that much out. That afternoon, she'd received a notice from her landlord. Her lease wasn't being renewed. When she called to ask why, the man had been apologetic but firm. "Orders from above," he'd said. The building was owned by Hutchinson Properties. She'd also received a call from the manager at the grocery store where she worked part-time, stocking shelves and helping with inventory. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Linda had said, her voice thick with regret. "Corporate says we have to let you go. Budget cuts." They both knew there were no budget cuts. Richard Hutchinson's brother-in-law was on the corporate board, but Sarah had faced worse than losing a job and an apartment. She had watched friends die. She had felt bullets tear through her flesh. She had lain in a hospital bed, wondering if she would ever walk again. Richard Hutchinson's pressure tactics were nothing compared to that. "I'm not dropping the charges," Sarah said quietly. Jack nodded as if he'd never doubted it. "Didn't think you would. You always did have a spine of steel." They ate Emma's sandwiches in silence, and Sarah felt grateful for friends who stood by her even when it cost them something. The next morning, Sarah woke to find her car had been vandalized. Someone had spray-painted "liar" across the hood in red letters. When she called Officer Tom Brennan to report it, he arrived, looking exhausted. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Tom said, taking photos of the damage. "I'm doing everything I can, but there's pressure coming from everywhere. The chief is getting calls from the mayor. The mayor is getting calls from Richard Hutchinson. They want this to go away." "I'm sure they do," Sarah said. "But that little girl got hit because some entitled brat thought he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. If we let him walk away from this, what lesson does that teach him? What lesson does it teach every other bully in this town?" Tom met her eyes, and she saw the conflict there. He wanted to do the right thing, but he was young and vulnerable to pressure from above. "The arraignment is tomorrow," Tom said. "The judge will probably set bail, and Brad will be out by lunch. His father's already hired Marcus Webb." Sarah's heart sank. Marcus Webb was one of the most expensive defense attorneys in Virginia, known for getting rich clients out of trouble through technicalities and aggressive courtroom tactics. "Tom," Sarah said carefully, "I need you to make sure that security footage from the diner is properly stored. Make multiple copies. Put them somewhere safe." Understanding flickered across Tom's face. "You think they'll try to make it disappear?" "I think Richard Hutchinson is used to making problems disappear. I think he's already trying to make me disappear by taking away my job and my home. A video file would be much easier." Tom nodded slowly. "I'll handle it personally. And Sarah, for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing." After Tom left, Sarah sat on her porch steps and let herself feel the weight of it all. She was facing homelessness, unemployment, and the wrath of the most powerful family in town. Her military pension covered her basic needs, but finding a new apartment and job in Riverside would be nearly impossible with the Hutchinsons working against her. She could leave. She could pack up her few belongings and move to another town, start fresh somewhere else where the Hutchinson name meant nothing. It would be easier, smarter maybe. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Katie's face. She saw the red mark on the girl's cheek. She heard the crack of Brad's hand connecting with flesh, and she knew she couldn't walk away. Some battles chose you. You didn't get to decide whether to fight. You only got to decide how you would fight. Sarah went inside and made a phone call. It was time to reach out to someone she hadn't spoken to in 2 years. Someone who owed her a favor. Someone with connections that went far beyond one small town in Virginia. When Colonel James Hartford answered the phone, his voice was surprised but warm. "Sarah Mitchell, I never thought I'd hear from you again." "I need your help, sir," Sarah said, "and I need you to trust me when I say this is important." She told him everything, and when she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'll make some calls," Colonel Hartford said finally. "Nobody threatens one of my soldiers. Nobody." Sarah hung up, feeling something she hadn't felt since the incident began: hope. The Hutchinsons had power in Riverside. But Sarah had something better. She had honor, determination, and friends in places they couldn't touch. The Riverside County Courthouse was built in 1897, a stately brick building with white columns that spoke of a time when justice and dignity were supposedly inseparable. On the morning of Brad Hutchinson's arraignment, The courthouse steps were crowded with people, some there to support Sarah and Katie, others drawn by curiosity or loyalty to the Hutchinson family. Sarah wore her full dress uniform, medals included. She had debated this choice, knowing it might seem like she was using her service for sympathy. But Colonel Hartford had been clear in his advice. You earned those medals through blood and sacrifice. Don't hide them. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of what you've done for this country. Margaret Reynolds sat beside Sarah on a bench in the courthouse hallway, holding Katie's hand. The girl had been quiet all morning, scared of seeing Brad again. But she had insisted on coming, wanting to show she wasn't afraid. Thank you, Margaret said softly to Sarah. I know this has cost you everything. Sarah shook her head. Not everything, just things. Things can be replaced. But if we had stayed silent, something irreplaceable would have been lost. Katie sensed that the world has justice in it, that adults will protect children, that bullies don't always win. Before Margaret could respond, the courthouse doors opened, and Marcus Webb swept in like a man who owned the building. He was 55, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Sarah's car. Behind him came Richard and Denise Hutchinson, Brad's parents. Richard Hutchinson was tall and broad-shouldered, his face perpetually red as if he was always on the verge of anger. Denise was thin and elegant, her expression carefully neutral. Brad walked between them, wearing a suit that made him look older, more innocent somehow. The Hutchinson family didn't even glance at Katie and her mother. They walked past as if the Reynoldses didn't exist. But Richard Hutchinson stopped when he reached Sarah. He looked down at her, his eyes cold. This could have been settled quietly, he said, his voice low enough that only Sarah and those immediately around her could hear. But you chose to make it public. You chose to humiliate my family. That was a mistake. Sarah stood up, meeting his gaze. Even though he was taller, she didn't feel small. Your son chose to hit a disabled child. That was the mistake. Everything that's happened since has been consequences. Richard's face darkened. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Actually, I do, Sarah said calmly. I'm dealing with a man who thinks money and power place him above the law. I'm dealing with a man who raised a son who believes he can hurt people without punishment. I'm dealing with exactly the kind of person I spent 10 years defending this country against. Bullies who prey on the weak. For a moment, Sarah thought Richard might actually take a swing at her right there in the courthouse. His fists clenched, his jaw worked. But Marcus Webb placed a hand on his client's father's arm, and Richard turned away without another word. Inside the courtroom, Judge Patricia Harmon presided. She was in her late 60s, a sharp-eyed woman who had been on the bench for 20 years. Sarah didn't know much about her, only that she had a reputation for fairness and an intolerance for lawyers who wasted her time. The arraignment was quick. Brad pleaded not guilty. Marcus Webb argued eloquently that his client was a good student, a star athlete with no prior criminal record, and that releasing him on bail posed no threat to the community. When it was the prosecution's turn, Assistant District Attorney Nina Reeves stood up. She was young, probably fresh out of law school, and Sarah's heart sank slightly. The county had given this case to a rookie, which suggested they weren't taking it seriously. But Nina's voice was strong as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. The defendant and his friends deliberately targeted and harassed a disabled minor before assaulting her in a public place. This demonstrates a pattern of bullying behavior and a lack of remorse. The victim's family is concerned about retaliation. Judge Harmon set bail at $50,000, high for a juvenile case, but the Hutchinsons paid it before lunch, just as Tom had predicted. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Sarah. Miss Mitchell, why did you get involved? Are you concerned about retaliation? Do you think your military service gives you special authority in civilian matters? Sarah answered briefly and honestly. I got involved because a child needed help. Anyone with a conscience would have done the same. And no, my military service doesn't give me special authority. It just taught me that standing up to bullies is always the right choice, even when it's difficult. That afternoon, Sarah's story went viral. Someone had recorded her confrontation with Richard Hutchinson in the courthouse hallway and posted it online. Within hours, the video had hundreds of thousands of views. By evening, it was trending on multiple social media platforms. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about a small-town incident. It was about justice, disability rights, military service, and the power of standing up for what's right. News crews from Richmond and Washington, D.C. descended on Riverside. Katie's story spread across the internet. Disability advocacy groups rallied behind her. Veterans organizations rallied behind Sarah. Richard Hutchinson, who was used to controlling the narrative in his small town, found himself facing something he couldn't control, public opinion on a national scale. But he didn't give up. Instead, he doubled down. Marcus Webb held a press conference announcing that Brad Hutchinson had been the real victim, that Sarah Mitchell had threatened and intimidated his client, that the diner incident had been blown out of proportion, that Katie had accidentally been bumped in a crowded restaurant. "The security footage will prove my client's innocence," Webb declared confidently. Sarah watched the press conference from her temporary hotel room. She'd had to move out of her apartment, and no landlord in Riverside would rent to her. But supporters from around the country had started a fundraising campaign to help with her expenses. When Webb mentioned the security footage, Sarah felt a cold chill. She immediately called Tom Brennan. "Tom, the defense is claiming they have security footage that exonerates Brad. Tell me you still have the real footage." "I do," Tom said, but his voice was tight. "Sarah, something's wrong. The chief called me into his office today. He asked me to turn over all copies of the footage. When I asked why, he said it was standard procedure for high-profile cases, but it's not. I've never heard of that protocol." "Don't give it to him," Sarah said urgently. "Tom, I think they're going to try to swap it out or edit it. If I refuse, I could lose my job. If you hand it over, an innocent family loses their justice, and a guilty boy learns that his family's money can erase his crimes." There was a long silence. Sarah could almost hear Tom wrestling,